Imagine a world where your entire identity, your home, your very survival depended on one person. Now imagine that person is suddenly gone. What happens when the only safety net you ever knew vanishes in a heartbeat? What if this terrifying reality hit you, not today, but in the year 1275? Number 7. Sudden plunge into poverty and debt. Picture this. One moment, you are the lady of the house, perhaps overseeing a bustling household, managing servants and raising children. Your status, your very existence, is intrinsically linked to your husband. He is the master, the provider, the legal head of the household. His land, his livestock, his trade, these are the sources of your family's security. Then, in the blink of an eye, he is gone. A sudden illness, a tragic accident, a skirmish on a distant border. Life in 1275 was precarious, and death could arrive without warning. When the news came, a silence would fall over the hall, heavier than any sorrow. Beneath the profound grief, a chilling realization would begin to dawn. Your world, as you knew it, had just shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a brutal new reality was about to set in. In medieval England, a woman's economic standing was almost entirely dependent on her husband. A married woman, known as a feme covert, had no independent legal identity. Property, her earnings, her very contracts were subsumed by her husband's. She could not sue or be sued independently. She existed, in the eyes of the law, as an extension of him. When he died, it was as if the legal foundation beneath her feet dissolved. While it is true that medieval law did provide for widows, primarily through dower, the path to claiming and benefiting from this provision was fraught with peril and often led directly into the jaws of destitution. Dower was the widow's share of her late husband's lands, typically 1/3. It was meant to provide for her sustenance, a lifeline to prevent her from falling into utter penury. It was a right that had been cemented in custom for centuries and was even reinforced in foundational legal documents of the age, such as the Magna Carta of 1215, which declared that a widow shall have her marriage portion and her inheritance without difficulty. Sounds promising, doesn't it? But the reality was far more complex and often far more cruel. The right to dower did not automatically translate into easy access or a comfortable income. Imagine the widow of a prosperous knight, suddenly left to manage 1/3 of his complex estate, perhaps scattered lands, tenants with their own grievances, and harvests dependent on the whims of the weather. She was not only grieving, but suddenly thrust into the role of a land manager, a task for which many women were not formally educated or prepared. Her ability to administer this portion, to collect rents, and to ensure its productivity was often limited by her inexperience and the societal expectation that such matters were handled by men. The value of this dower land could also be contentious. Was it 1/3 of the best lands, or the least productive? Was it subject to existing debts or mortgages? These were questions that could drag on for years in the local courts, consuming precious resources and mental energy. A widow might find herself locked in a bitter dispute with her late husband's heirs, usually his eldest son or closest male relatives, who would naturally want to maximize their inheritance. These heirs might try to reduce the dower portion, delay its assignment, or assign her less valuable land, hoping to pressure her into a less demanding claim or even into remarrying someone of their choosing. The legal system, while theoretically offering redress, was slow, expensive, and heavily reliant on male advocates and judges. A widow without a powerful male relative to champion her cause often found herself at a distinct disadvantage, navigating a labyrinth of legal custom and formality that was designed for men. Beyond the dower, there was the crushing burden of debt. When a man died, his debts did not simply vanish. They became the responsibility of his estate. And if that estate was insolvent, the widow could find herself personally liable, or at the very least, stripped of any movable property that might have been part of her late husband's belongings. Imagine a knight who had taken out loans to purchase new armor, to fund a pilgrimage, or to make improvements to his castle. Upon his death, these debts would fall upon his surviving family. Dower, even if secured, might be insufficient to cover these liabilities, or the collectors might seize the very crops and livestock that were meant to feed her and her children. There are records from the royal courts of widows being pursued by creditors, their few remaining possessions, like a silver goblet or a fine wool cloak, at risk of being confiscated. This was not merely an inconvenience. It could mean the difference between having a roof over one's head and begging on the roadside. Moreover, if her husband had held land as a tenant-in-chief directly from the king or from a powerful lord, there might be significant feudal payments due upon his death, known as relief. This payment was essentially an inheritance tax, a sum paid to the lord to confirm the heir's right to the land. Heir was a minor, the lands would fall into the lord's wardship, and the lord would collect the revenues. While the widow might be entitled to her dower from these lands, the immediate financial drain of the relief, coupled with the potential loss of control over the remainder of the estate during wardship, could leave her with almost no liquid assets. She might have a right to land, but no ready money for food, heating, or the simple necessities of daily life. The sudden silence of an empty purse, the hollow echo in a larder that was once full, was a far more terrifying sound than the tolling of the funeral bell. Number 6. Losing your home, literally. Imagine the house you have lived in, raised your children in, poured your life into, suddenly no longer truly belongs to you. 1275, for a woman, the concept of home was often ephemeral, a conditional privilege tied inextricably to her marital status and the whims of her husband's family. While a widow might be entitled to her dower, this did not always mean she retained the marital home, or even that she had immediate, secure access to a dwelling. The threat of displacement, of being turned out from the only place she knew as her own, was a very real and terrifying prospect. General custom, often reflected in legal texts like Bracton's treatise on English law from the mid-13th century, was that a widow had a right to quarantine, meaning she could remain in her late husband's chief dwelling house for 40 days after his death. This was a temporary reprieve, a brief window for her dower to be assigned, to gather her belongings, and to perhaps begin the difficult task of finding a new place to live. 40 days, that's it. Imagine the weight of those days, ticking by as she grieved, while simultaneously trying to secure her future. This temporary right, while offering a moment of grace, also underscored the fragility of her position. It was a stark reminder that the very roof over her head was not truly hers, but an inheritance for her late husband's heir. After those 40 days, unless the chief dwelling itself was assigned as part of her dower, which was rare for a significant dwelling, as it was often the symbol of the heir's status and the center of the estate, she would be expected to vacate. Where would she go? Perhaps to a smaller, less significant property that formed part of her dower lands, often far from the familiar routines and neighbors she knew. Or if her dower had not yet been assigned, or if she had no children to support her, she might find herself reliant on the charity of relatives, a precarious and often humiliating position. The notion of a woman independently purchasing or owning a substantial home was almost unheard of in 1275, unless she was of exceptional wealth and standing, and even then, her property rights could be challenged by male relatives. Even if a portion of land was assigned to her as dower, it might not come with an adequate dwelling. She might be given a stretch of farmland, or a few scattered fields without any house, or perhaps only a dilapidated cottage. This would leave her with the immediate and daunting task of finding or building a suitable home, a significant financial burden at a time when her resources were already stretched thin. Consider a wealthy widow, whose dower might include an entire manor or a significant portion of a large estate. Even then, the chief manor house, the one with the grand hall and the best defenses, was almost always reserved for the heir. She would instead be assigned a dower house, perhaps a secondary residence on the estate, or a property that had been neglected, requiring substantial repair. This was not a move of choice, but a forced relocation, often accompanied by a significant reduction in her living standards and comfort. Furthermore, the complexities of feudal tenure meant that even if a woman brought land into a marriage as part of her dowry, it did not necessarily remain hers if her husband died without male heirs, or if specific conditions were not met. The land might revert to her husband's family, or even to the lord from whom it was held. This concept of reversion meant that property, especially land, was less about individual ownership and more about a chain of obligations and rights tied to male lineage. A widow could find herself stripped of her family's ancestral lands simply because her husband had died without siring a son. Imagine the despair of losing not only your husband, but also the lands that had been in your family for generations, all because of an accident of birth and a legal system designed to consolidate power and property within male lines. The emotional toll of this displacement cannot be overstated. A home in the 13th century was not just a structure, it was the center of social life, the seat of family identity, and often the heart of economic activity. To be removed from it was to be uprooted from one's entire social, and emotional landscape. It meant leaving behind familiar faces, local markets, and perhaps even the graves of loved ones. For a widow already reeling from loss, the prospect of being forced to find a new place, to establish new routines, and to rebuild a life from scratch without the financial or social support she once enjoyed was a terrifying and isolating experience. It was a literal and figurative homelessness, a stark symbol of her diminished status and vulnerability in a world that offered little comfort to those outside the established male order. Number 5. Becoming a pawn in the marriage market. Imagine a life where your personal choices, your desires, and your very heart have little bearing on your future. For a widow in 1275, marriage was not primarily a matter of love or even companionship. It was a transaction, a strategic alliance, and for women with property, a valuable commodity. Upon her husband's death, a widow, especially one with significant dower lands or an attractive inheritance, instantly became a highly sought-after prize in the brutal and often cynical medieval marriage market. She was no longer a young maiden to be traded for a dowry, but a woman with assets, experience, and perhaps even children. This made her both desirable and a potential burden, placing her in a precarious position where her future was dictated not by her own will, but by the ambitions of powerful men. For the king or a powerful lord, a wealthy widow was a valuable piece of property. Her late husband was a tenant-in-chief, holding land directly from the crown, then the king himself held the right to control her remarriage. This was not a benevolent protection, it was a lucrative source of revenue. The king could sell the right to marry a wealthy widow to the highest bidder, often a royal favorite or a loyal knight, who would then secure her lands and potentially her resources for himself. Imagine being presented with a stranger, a man you did not know, perhaps significantly older or younger, perhaps with a difficult reputation, and being told that he was to be your new husband, as decreed by the king. Refusal could lead to severe penalties, including the forfeiture of her dower lands, effectively stripping her of her only means of support. Feelings, her grief, her desire for autonomy, were utterly irrelevant in this system of power and patronage. Even if she was not a tenant-in-chief's widow, her male relatives, her late husband's family, her own father or brothers, or even her adult sons, would often exert immense pressure on her to remarry. Their motivations were varied but rarely centered on her happiness. Her late husband's family might want her to marry someone who would protect their interests, perhaps a younger brother of the deceased, to keep the dower lands within the family. Her own family might see her remarriage as an opportunity to gain an alliance with a powerful neighbor, or to rid themselves of the financial burden of supporting her. Her adult sons might pressure her to marry someone who could manage the estate she held in dower, or someone who could provide her with protection they were unable or unwilling to offer. For them, a widow represented either an asset to be leveraged or a vulnerability that needed to be secured. The options available to a widow were incredibly limited. She could remarry, accept her fate, and hope for the best. This often meant sacrificing her independence, stepping into a new household dynamic, and potentially navigating complex relationships with stepchildren and a new husband who might be less than benevolent. She might find herself managing a new estate, bearing more children, and re-entering the demanding cycle of medieval domestic life, often with little power or respect in her new marriage. Or she could choose to remain chaste and unmarried. This was a noble and often pious choice, lauded by the church, but it came with its own set of immense challenges. A widow who chose to remain unmarried often had to pay a fine to her lord or the king to secure this right, if her late husband had been a royal tenant. This payment, known as a fine not to marry, was a substantial sum, another financial drain on an already precarious existence, and even if she paid, she remained vulnerable. Without a male protector, she was a target for legal disputes, land grabs, and social exploitation. Her status as a femme sole, a woman acting independently in law, which a widow theoretically was, did not automatically grant her true security or respect. She was an anomaly, an independent woman in a patriarchal world, often viewed with suspicion or pity. Constant pressure to remarry was not merely social, it was systemic. For a woman, remaining unmarried meant navigating a world designed for coupled existence, without the legal, financial, or physical protection of a husband. She might find herself isolated, unable to participate fully in social life, or vulnerable to accusations of impropriety. Choice was rarely her own. It was a grim calculation of lesser evils, a desperate attempt to secure a modicum of stability in a world determined to define her by her relationships to men. Her heart, her desires, her very soul were often mere pawns in a much larger game of power and property. Number 4, stripped of legal protection and standing. Imagine a world where your voice in a court of law is muted, where your testimony is viewed with suspicion, and where securing justice often requires a male shadow to stand beside you. For a woman in 1275, her legal standing was a shifting, uncertain landscape, utterly dependent on her marital status. While a married woman, a feme covert, had almost no independent legal rights, her identity subsumed by her husband's, a widow theoretically regained some legal agency as a feme soul. She could sue and be sued, make contracts, and manage her own affairs. This sounds like liberation, a step towards independence. The reality was far more complex, leaving many widows vulnerable, without the robust legal protection they desperately needed. The very concept of a woman acting independently in the formal legal system of the late 13th century was fraught with difficulties. Courts, whether manorial, shire, or royal, were dominated by men: male judges, male juries, male lawyers, male witnesses. The language of the law was Latin or Anglo-Norman French, complex and inaccessible to most, especially women who often lacked formal education. To navigate this system, a widow almost always required a male advocate, a patron, or a relative to represent her interests, to speak for her, and to guide her through the arcane procedures. Even if she possessed keen intelligence and determination, the institutional barriers were immense. Consider the common scenario of a dower dispute. As discussed earlier, securing her rightful 1/3 of her late husband's lands was rarely straightforward. The heirs, perhaps a greedy stepson or a distant cousin, might challenge her claim, deny her access to specific lands, or attempt to undervalue her portion. Despite this, a widow would have to initiate legal action, a daunting prospect. She would need to hire a reeve or a bailiff to manage her newly acquired dower lands, a man who might exploit her lack of oversight or knowledge of land management. She might need to appear before a court, presenting her case, gathering evidence, and enduring cross-examination in a public forum that was often hostile or dismissive of women. The legal fees, the travel expenses, the sheer time and emotional drain of such a process could quickly exhaust her already limited resources, forcing her to abandon her claim or settle for a far less favorable outcome. Beyond dower, widows often found themselves entangled in property disputes unrelated to their marriage, or even accusations of wrongdoing. Perhaps a neighbor encroached on her dower land, or a former servant stole from her. If she had debts or was owed money, she would have to pursue these claims herself. Without the protection of a husband, who in his lifetime would have handled such matters, she stood alone. Her vulnerability was not lost on others. Unscrupulous individuals might see her as an easy target, someone whose legal claims could be ignored, whose property could be seized, or whose rights could be trampled upon, simply because she lacked the immediate male authority to challenge them effectively. The concept of a man of straw illustrates this vulnerability. A powerful man might set up a man of straw, someone without assets or reputation, to act on his behalf in a dispute against a widow. If the widow won the case, she could not collect damages from the man of straw. If she lost, she was out of pocket for legal fees and potentially lost her land. This was a tactic used to exploit those without powerful connections, and widows were prime targets. Perceived weakness in the legal arena made them ripe for such predatory tactics. Furthermore, a widow's testimony in court could be viewed with suspicion. While she was not outright barred from testifying, societal norms often cast women as emotionally volatile or less rational than men. Their word might not carry the same weight as a man's, especially in serious criminal matters or complex land disputes. This prejudice, ingrained in the social and legal perceptions of the age, added another layer of difficulty for a widow seeking justice or defending her rights. She might have the truth on her side, but convincing a jury of men steeped in patriarchal assumptions was an entirely different challenge. The legal system, while theoretically offering a path to justice for a feme soul, was designed for a male-dominated world, leaving many widows legally exposed, vulnerable, and ultimately, often powerless. Number 3, your children's future hanging by a thread. Imagine that the very people you love most in the world, your own children, suddenly become pawns in a complicated game of inheritance, wardship, and family ambition. and you, their mother, have limited power to protect them. 1275, a widow's grief for her lost husband was often compounded by immediate, agonizing anxieties about the future of her children. Prospects, their inheritance, their education, and even their very care could be snatched away or drastically altered, often beyond her control, leaving her distraught and helpless. The most profound threat to a widow's children, especially if they were minors, stemmed from the system of wardship. Her late husband held land directly from the king, as a tenant-in-chief or from a powerful lord, and if his heir was still a minor, under 21 for a male, 14 for a female, then the lord or the king had the right to wardship over the heir and their lands. This meant the lord or king would take control of the deceased's lands and revenues until the heir came of age. While the lord was theoretically obliged to maintain the heir and ensure their proper upbringing, the reality was often far more cynical. Wardship was a highly lucrative right, often sold off to the highest bidder. Imagine your son or daughter, perhaps just a small child, being handed over to a stranger, sometimes a ruthless businessman or a distant noble, who would manage their inheritance for his own profit. This guardian might neglect the child's education, allow their lands to fall into disrepair, or even arrange a disadvantageous marriage for them, all to maximize short-term gain. As the widow, you, the mother, often had little to no say in this. While it was sometimes possible for a wealthy widow to buy the wardship of her own children from the lord or king, this required a substantial payment, another drain on her already strained resources. If she could not afford it, her children could be taken from her care, sent to live in a stranger's household, perhaps far from home. This was not a unique tragedy, but a common legal practice, leaving countless mothers heartbroken and powerless. The bond between mother and child, so fundamental, was brutally severed by the dictates of feudal law. Furthermore, if the widow herself remarried, the implications for her children from the first marriage were profound and often negative. A new husband would become the legal head of her household, and while he might be benevolent, he had no inherent legal obligation to her children from a previous marriage. Their inheritance, if it was tied to their deceased father's lineage, might become more complex. The new husband might be less inclined to provide for stepchildren, especially if he had children of his own. If the widow bore children with her new husband, the inheritance landscape could become even more tangled, potentially diminishing the share or prospects of her older children. There were also questions of their social standing and alliances. The identity of children in 1275 was inextricably linked to their father's lineage. If their mother remarried, especially into a less prominent family, or into a family with existing rivalries, it could impact their own future marriage prospects, their standing in the community, and their ability to claim their rightful place in their deceased father's family. Imagine a son, destined to inherit a knightly estate, suddenly finding his mother remarried to a commoner, or to a family with whom his own family had a long-standing feud. This could shatter his future, compromise his honor, and even lead to his ostracization by his paternal relatives. The emotional impact on the children themselves, ripped from their mother's care or seeing their mother's precarious situation, would have been immense. They would bear witness to their mother's struggle, her diminished status, and the desperate attempts she made to secure their collective future. For a widow, the inability to shield her children from these harsh realities, to provide the stability and security they deserved, was a constant, crushing burden, adding another layer of despair to her already tumultuous life. Children's future, once seemingly assured by their father's standing, now hung by the fragile thread of legal precedent and the mercy of powerful men. Number 2, social stigma and isolation. Imagine finding yourself not just grieving, not just struggling financially, but suddenly viewed with suspicion, pity, or even disdain by the very society you once belonged to. For a widow in 1275, the death of her husband often heralded not only personal tragedy, but also a profound shift in her social standing, leading to a chilling sense of isolation and a pervasive social stigma. She was no longer the wife of X, a respected member of a coupled unit. She was a widow, a category that often carried a complex mix of pity, fear, and practical concern for her welfare and potential drain on resources. Church, a dominant force in medieval society, held contradictory views on widowhood. On one hand, it venerated the chaste widow, a pious woman who devoted her remaining years to God and prayer, a spiritual ideal often embodied by figures like the Virgin Mary. Such a widow, particularly one who chose not to remarry, might gain a certain moral authority and respect. However, this was a narrow path, often requiring great personal sacrifice and adherence to strict religious observance. For the vast majority of widows who needed to navigate the practicalities of survival, this pious ideal was largely unattainable, and failing to conform to it could lead to quiet disapproval. More commonly, widows were perceived through a more pragmatic and often negative lens. If she was wealthy, she became a target, as we've explored, for powerful men seeking to control her assets. But if she was impoverished, she became a burden. Her late husband's family, who might have once welcomed her as a daughter-in-law, could now view her as an unwanted obligation, especially if her dower was small or difficult to extract. They might resent the portion of land she held, seeing it as a reduction of their own inheritance. She might be ostracized from family gatherings, her presence a stark reminder of their loss or a cause for awkwardness. For the community at large, a widow represented an anomaly. A woman without a husband, without a male protector in a society built on male authority, was an unsettling figure. She might be seen as vulnerable to temptation, both physically and morally, as the protective shield of her husband was gone. Gossip could spread quickly, questioning her character, her management of her affairs, or even the circumstances of her husband's death. Imagine being whispered about in the village market, your every move scrutinized, your loneliness misinterpreted as impropriety. This relentless social pressure could make a widow deeply distrustful of others and often lead to further self-isolation. Furthermore, a widow's social interactions might be curtailed. She could no longer attend certain social functions as a couple, and her presence might be awkward among other married couples. She might find herself excluded from gatherings of women, such as spinning bees or church groups, as she was no longer part of the established social units. Her network of support, once strong through her husband's connections, could rapidly dwindle. Friends and acquaintances might shy away, unsure how to interact with her changed status, or fearing that her misfortunes might somehow rub off on them. The silence of an empty house, once shared with a bustling family, would echo with a profound sense of loneliness. The challenge of raising children alone in such a social climate was immense. If she was the sole caregiver, she had to navigate societal judgment and provide for her children without the social standing or economic leverage of a male partner. Children, too, might face the stigma of having a widowed mother, potentially affecting their own social standing and marriage prospects. This societal pressure, subtle yet pervasive, could undermine a widow's self-worth, diminish her confidence, and leave her feeling utterly alone in a world that suddenly seemed to have turned its back on her. The warmth of community, once a comfort, could turn chillingly cold, leaving her stranded in a desolate landscape of social isolation. Number 1, the monastery or a life of solitude, not by choice. Imagine a decision so monumental that it defines the rest of your life, yet it is presented to you not as a choice, but as the only viable escape from a bleak and precarious existence. For many widows in 1275, entering a convent or committing to a life of perpetual solitude and chastity was not a spiritual calling, but a grim necessity, often forced upon them by the relentless pressures of a society that offered few other safe havens. It was a trade-off, security and a degree of social acceptance in exchange for their remaining autonomy and any hope of a personal future outside the confines of the cloister. For a widow who possessed some wealth, or whose family wished to provide for her in a respectable manner without the complications of remarriage, a convent could seem like a merciful option. Nunneries offered a structured environment, a community of women, and a spiritual purpose. They provided physical security, regular meals, and a roof over one's head. For women who were educated, or who had a genuine religious calling, it could be a life of quiet dignity and intellectual pursuit. However, entry into a convent was not free. It required a significant payment, a dowry to the convent, to cover the costs of her upkeep and to demonstrate her commitment. For a struggling widow, already bereft of resources, this payment could be a monumental hurdle, requiring her family to shoulder the burden. If she had no family willing or able to pay, the convent doors would remain firmly shut. For those without the means to enter a convent, or for whom the cloistered life held no appeal, the alternative was a life of involuntary solitude. This was not the solitude of quiet contemplation or personal choice, but a lonely existence dictated by circumstance. Without a husband, without family support, and without the means to sustain herself independently, a widow could find herself living on the fringes of society, dependent on casual labor, the charity of others, or even begging. Imagine an older widow, perhaps without adult children. Her dower lands too small or too unproductive to sustain her, facing the prospect of eking out an existence with no social safety net. The only option might be to live with distant relatives as a perpetual guest, enduring their unspoken resentment, or to find a tiny, rented room in a village, barely scraping by. Constant pressure to remain chaste, reinforced by both church teachings and societal expectations, meant that a widow who did not remarry was expected to live a life free from romantic or sexual relationships. While this might be a personal choice for some, for others it was a restrictive imposition, denying them the potential for companionship, affection, or a new family life. Any deviation from this expectation could lead to severe social condemnation, further isolating her and jeopardizing any meager standing she might have. This forced choice between a convent and extreme poverty, or between a forced remarriage and a life of vulnerable solitude, stripped a widow of her remaining autonomy. Agency, already diminished by her marital status and the patriarchal legal system, was now almost entirely eradicated. The path she took was often less about her own desires and more about the limited and unappealing options presented to her by a society unprepared to support independent women. Her life was reduced to a set of grim calculations, a weighing of lesser evils. Convent for many became a gilded cage, offering safety and sustenance, but at the cost of personal freedom and the possibility of a life truly lived on her own terms. For those who could not even afford the cage, the stark reality was a solitary struggle against relentless economic hardship and social indifference, a fate often more terrifying than the grave itself.